Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. I'm Maggie Rowe, the Marketing Events Manager here at Flyleaf Books. Thank you so much for joining us here at the store and online to celebrate the publication of The Black President by Claude Clegg in conversation with Max Orr. By purchasing your book for tonight's event from Flyleaf Books, you enable us to continue to bring great programs like this one to our community. I'd like to thank our co-partners, UNC's Carolina Public Humanities Department, who are live streaming this event over Zoom for folks at home. Claude has already signed and personalized books for folks who are here in the store before the talk. We have more copies of the book available for sale for those of you watching at home. The store closes to the public at 7 tonight, so we'll wrap up by then so we can be mindful of our colleagues who are closing up the store after the event. And now I'd like to introduce our author. Claude Clegg is a Lyle V. Jones Distinguished Professor of History and African-American and Diaspora Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, where his research focuses on the African diaspora of the Atlantic world, exploring the ways in which people of African descent have created and imagined communities and identities outside of Africa. He received his BA in Political Science and Afro-American Studies at UNC Chapel Hill and his MA and PhD in History from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. Before moving to Chapel Hill in 2015, he taught at Indiana University at Bloomington, where he served as chair of the Department of History, and at North Carolina A&T State University. His published books include An Original Man, The Life and Times of Elijah Muhammad, Troubled Ground, A Tale of Murder, Lynching, and Reckoning in the New South, and The Price of Liberty, African Americans and the Making of Liberia, which was a 2004 Choice Magazine Outstanding Academic Title and a finalist for the Frederick Douglass Book Prize. He has been associate editor for the Journal of American History, as well as editor of the Blacks in the Diaspora book series by Indiana University Press, and he has appeared on National Public Radio, Black Entertainment Television, and C-SPAN's Book Notes. And now I'd like to pass the mic over to Max to be in conversation with Claude. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Maggie. And I want to thank everyone here at Flyleaf Books, Jamie Fiocco and Morella, especially Morella Brazal as well, for all their help in setting this up. And we want to thank Paul Bonici for setting up the live stream today. But Vicky Breeden is actually running the ship back there. So thank you, Vicky, for that as well. We want to get right into it with what we have on store today. So I'll just tell you how we're doing. I'm going to start with having Claude give a few words, remarks about how he came up with the book, and then we'll do a moderated discussion. I have some questions that we've prepared, and Claude's taken a look at a few of those, so we won't throw anything surprises at you. But then we'll stop and have enough time for questions from the audience. So I want to remind you folks out in the ether out there that you can use the button at the bottom of your screen, and I'll pull questions off. And of course, if you're in here in the audience, we'll just call on you directly. So without further ado, Claude, tell us why you wrote this book and give us a little opening statement on how you came up with this idea and this whole project.
Thank you so much, Max, for having me. Thanks for Flyleaf Books. Thanks to them for hosting. Thanks to Carolina Public Humanities for the good idea, I think, for having us in the first place. Thanks to colleagues, friends, well-wishers, and others for attending this event. So I'm very appreciative. How did this begin? I can remember the 2008 presidential election primaries and the Democratic side in particular. And I think many other people were riveted by this back and forth between these two senators. Junior Senator from Illinois, Barack Obama, whom 6 months earlier, most people could not remember that name, and I even pronounced it properly in many instances. And of course, two-term senator from New York, former First Lady Hillary Clinton. And so they were pretty evenly matched. So sort of the back and forth, I just found fascinating. I think millions of Americans who were looking. So at that moment, I knew something historic was happening and was going to happen. Either you're going to have the first African-American to be the Democratic nominee for president, or you're going to have the first woman. And potentially one of those folks would become the president of the United States. So something I had, with my historian's antenna up, I knew something historic was going to happen. The question, of course, for the historian was how to think historically about something that you were witnessing. Or as I learned over the time of building an archive to write about this, how to think historically about something and come up with a historical argument or set of arguments without the benefit of historical hindsight. The Obama presidency would not become history until January 20th of 2017. So you'd have to actually witness this thing to its conclusion. And of course, it raises the questions of the positionality of the historian. In this case, I become a source. I become part of the context for the history itself. And I'm a very traditional historian in regard to, I think, my training and maybe my perspective on a lot of things. Insofar as I'm much more comfortable looking in the rearview mirror and seeing something on which the dust is already settled. And then making some judgments from a distance and trying to get objective or some sort of objective footing in regard to how to think about the subject. But this didn't allow me to do this. You know, this is something that I'm witnessing. This is something I'm in the context of. This is something I need to build an archive and collect all the things I can, and then a roll of the dice. Would I get it right? Being inside of this, witnessing this thing, would what I wanted to talk about or what I thought was important in the moment be what historians 50 years from now think is important? Did Clegg miss it? Did, you know, him witnessing this thing, he was too close to it? Did he miss these other set of things that are the big takeaways from the Obama presidency as opposed to what he thinks is? So that's also working in the background. So of course, the impetus is to collect everything so that you won't miss anything. That's a double-edged sword in regard to the sources, and we can talk more about that. One of the good things about the 21st century is that there's so many different sources. You can do a lot of the research from your computer, you know, from the internet. A lot of this stuff has been digitized. And if you're working on a recent topic, the press stuff, the YouTube videos, all the speeches, the government records, much of that's digitized. And even, you know, my interviews, a number of those were Zoom interviews with folks who are around him. So an amazing amount of stuff that you could get done on the topic. But of course, there's all of the noise too. Not only is there a plethora of sources and kinds of sources in our digital age, but just the sheer quantity of it. So, for example, if you're online, you're looking at political blogs or political newspapers that cover politics, it's not only the article that you need to read, but you need to read the 400 or go through the 400 comments, because actually the story is often in the comments, or the most thoughtful things about it are actually in the comments, although the article itself might be interesting. So that was new to me as a person who's typically writes about people who've been dead for a while, or places I've never visited, or time periods that are bygone time periods. So thinking about the craft of history as a historian who typically writes about the past in the rearview mirror, as opposed to the past through the windshield, and traveling through what will eventually become history, but it's not quite history. I think that was the challenge of the book, but it was a pleasant challenge at the end of the day. It was a very uncomfortable one to start with. But you know, if you think about it, political scientists and anthropologists and ethnographers, they do this all the time. They're watching the thing that they're writing about. So we historians tend not to do that, and thus the title historian. We wait until it has the sort of patina of history or some sort of settled dust around it. So that was again something I eventually became comfortable with. That is, watching this presidency go to its conclusion, learning as I'm watching, and trying to contextualize it. And, you know, if the book does nothing else, I hope that it contextualizes him within his time and within the presidencies before and after his.
You're right. And you're right. It is imperative along this very point. It is imperative that historians bring their conceptual tools and scholarly perspectives to bear on the recent past, lest their hesitance allow the interpretive void to be filled by simplistic narratives and disinformation that mislead the public and even corrupt its capacity for understanding events contemporary and remote. Did you already have some narratives that you had in mind that you were these simplistic narratives that you wanted to be taking on? And not necessarily the nefarious birtherism or things like that, but were there some simplistic narratives that you already saw develop?
Oh, I think so. Even going into his presidency and narratives about, you know, post-racialism and narratives about African Americans or Black America as a single corporate monolithic thing. that had fallen lockstep behind this guy and supported him throughout. It's a much more complicated picture than that. The book goes into many of the sort of discursive wars that go on in Black academia about the meaning of Obama. And he's not far enough to the left, or he's too beholden to corporate interests, or he's not doing enough for the poor and so forth. And then there's a Black conservatism that comes to life. It's always been there, but I think it comes to life, especially in the Obama years, in which it's there's a Black conservative critique, and it's not just a political one too. It's also one coming from the African American church in regard to his position on abortion rights, or his embrace of marriage equality and so forth. So that was a simplistic narrative that was in operation. But of course, the narrative that's taking shape on the right during his time period in office and is given voice by his successor, Donald Trump. And the need to, before his presidency is utterly misrepresented in the media, the need for scholars and people who write history and write serious politics and political studies and so forth, for us to grapple with the meaning of his presidency, and also the times before the misinformation and disinformation, the fake news and so forth that spreads so easily around the globe and around the internet and around social media. Fill in the void for what the public thinks this presidency was about, aided and abetted by a successor who would really, I think, love for us to have a misrepresented or a skewed view of what the Obama presidency was about, if only for his own aggrandizement about what his presidency and what he represented. So there was a certain urgency to the task, Max, to again build an archive that has a rich array of sources, and then to think hard about what had happened over that roughly a decade of time, and to try to conceptualize it in historical ways, or with a historical sense. I think we're far enough away from Obama's time to think about it and talk about it historically, and within the larger context of American society, American politics, what's happening in our world here in 2021.
Yeah, it's interesting we talk about this narrative of his presidency itself, but there's another narrative, of course, of Black political life in the United States. And so where does Obama fit, do you think, in that broader narrative? There's one sense that, and you write this as well, that some people say, well, he's arrived, this is done, we have the Black president. Your uncle was suggesting that this was something that, it fit at the end of this narrative. So, but there's something very different about Obama as well from the broader narrative. And of course, we're speaking in very broad generalizations here, but can you kind of place Obama's presidency in the trajectory of where Black politics, at least maybe since the civil rights movement had been developed?
All right, that's a great question. He's inside and outside of it, and overlapping and removed from it at the same time. He's a beneficiary, he'd be the first to say, of the civil rights movement, of the struggles of African-American people and others to expand what it means to be human and how that's valued in this country. He's a beneficiary of that. He's a beneficiary of politicians who've come before, whether it's Black mayors, whether it's Black people in Congress, whether it's African-Americans, a few that we've had in the Senate. So and he'll be the first to say that he was standing on the shoulders of giants and figures that came along at much more difficult times than he did. But if you look at his biography, yeah, he is not the sort of archetype that you'd expect to become the first African-American president. He's born in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. His father's an immigrant from Africa, his mother is from Kansas. He comes to the mainland only when he's more or less a young man going to school. Some of his background is I think very common conventional background for a president, but it's not very common conventional background for anyone else. So he's a product of Ivy League schools, Columbia and Harvard. He's a US senator. Before that, he was a state senator. So the idea that any Black person can become president because this guy did it No, there's certain, again, there's the Harvard pedigree, he's in the Senate and so forth. So in that way, his Black experience is an anomaly when it comes to most African Americans. He can't trace his ancestry to the American South. He can't trace it through slavery, segregation, and so forth in this country. And he's the first to admit that he comes to his African Americanness by another route than other people like a Jesse Jackson or Harold Washington and so forth. He'll be the first to admit that. So in a sense, he expands the possibilities or the shades or spectrum of what a Black politician could be. There are those who are critics of that is that he's not sort of authentically Black, and thus he can't authentically be a Black politician. He doesn't have the scars. His people don't have the same kinds of scars. He didn't fight for it. His people didn't fight for it. They're sort of interlopers who, and Obama himself, particularly an interloper, is sort of upstart. He gets a lot of that from all angles, whether it's Black politicians in Congress who think that he hasn't really put in the time, the Clintons themselves, who by 2008 have long careers in American politics. And the thinking was, and I think this is perhaps part of the undoing of Hillary Clinton and her run, was that there was a line of people, there were people in line for this office. And Hillary Clinton was her term. Two-term US Senator from New York, big Democratic state, former First Lady, two-term presidency of her husband. She was there. She was in the White House. She's in the Senate. This was her time. And again, I think that militates against her the possibility of her being, there are other things that are going on too. But I think the sort of entitlement that is, she's supposed to be the candidate, and Obama appearing from some would say from nowhere and on the stage of history. No, that's not fair. It wasn't supposed to be like that. And that was the thinking of the Clintons, and the thinking of a lot of Black politicians who the Clintons had lined up over years their support, that it'd be nice to vote for this Black guy to be president in 2016. But it is indeed her time, and he didn't come up through the ranks. He didn't. Where was he when King and others were marching in the 60s? Where were his people? Where was he? Or the 70s and 80s and so forth? Where was he? So I think he expands the realm of what a Black politician can be, but I think he does so in a way that is still very much a contentious way among folks who believe themselves more knowledgeable of what Black politicians should actually be and what their pedigree should be.
Talk a little bit about his political development, and we know he had an early interest in politics. He certainly, as you pointed, was raised in a very sort of not your traditional Black family, in that he had a father who was foreign and a white mother. Did those influence his politics in some way that was that differentiated in some substantive approaches or ways that he articulated policy?
Yeah, you're asking me to put Obama on the couch, on the psychiatrist's couch, which is a little bit beyond my pay grade and training, but I'll try. No, and I'll try. I think it's an interesting thought experiment. And much of this is speculative. As a politician, I think he's the realist, pragmatic, strategist type. He's very careful, although he has the capacity to surprise on occasion. So during the campaign of 2008 campaign, in the midst of watching his campaign explode in his face with a crisis over his former minister, Jeremiah Wright, and some things that he had said that were inflammatory, people thought were inflammatory. He gives his big speech in Philadelphia in March of 2008 on race, which staunched the bleeding of his campaign. It was a bold speech, one of the best speeches I think he's ever given, although it was sort of typical Obama, but to give the speech in that moment, I think saved his campaign. The Bin Laden raid, he gives the order to do that. That could have went sideways easily, and it doesn't. So he's by nature a careful man. He's by nature a sort of a cautious, strategic person. He's by nature a person who seeks consensus. who doesn't like drama, no drama Obama, but he does have the capacity to surprise. Where that comes from, you could say the in-betweenness of his existence. You could say that's part of it. You know, he's fathered by a African man and a white woman from Kansas. He's raised by white grandparents in the most diverse state in the country, in Hawaii. He lives in Indonesia. So he's used to sort of this amphibious, being able to move between worlds experience. Perhaps that makes him more likely to be sort of comfortable trying to negotiate sides and come up with consensus between warring parties or factions. Perhaps more is going there. His sort of his racial in-betweenness perhaps is part of that desire to bring people together and so forth. It's hard to know. Again, we can speculate, but we do know the kind of public persona that he is. It's careful, it's strategic, it's no drama, it's predictability, it's the technocrat. It's the guy who tries to do the best research as possible so you won't get surprised with the results at the end, although that doesn't always work out.
I imagine his education in law might have influenced his approach to politics as well.
I think that's exactly right. Although he was never, one of the things that, you know, put what I just said about the sort of strategic, careful pragmatist alongside the restlessness. He is, now imagine everyone who's ever ran for the office is profoundly ambitious. There's a section, the first section of the book, the first 3 chapters, that section is called A Chronic Restlessness. And those are actually his words from one of his books. It's this tick that he had. And I think he perhaps got it from his parents, because his father has that same sort of tick. It's from Kenya, it's to Hawaii, and then he's in Harvard, and then he's back to Africa, and he just can't. The present moment is just not good enough. What's in front of you is just not good enough. I think some of that's in his mother too, because she's all over the Pacific world during her lifetime as well. She eventually gets a PhD in anthropology from the University of Hawaii. She's in Indonesia, and then she's somewhere else in Asia, and then she's in Seattle and so forth. So he has that tick about him, that sort of itinerant spirit about him. I think that's one of the things in a sort of opposites attract sort of way that attracts him to Michelle Robinson, who he actually marries and becomes Michelle Obama, and she's every bit as accomplished as he is. But he has that tick that I think that she has somewhat of the ability to ground him in ways that he's never been grounded before. And I think he appreciates that, although the ambitiousness still is a through line for his entire career.
You know, not many people graduate from the finest law schools and go right into community organizing. What drove that, and what role does Chicago play in Barack Obama's political development and his relationship with, say, the community of Black leadership in Chicago?
Yeah, I think that Chicago, his stint in Chicago as a community organizer in the 80s is vitally important in regard to who he becomes. If you can imagine, he was once known as Barry Obama. That's what he's known as in his youth. His grandparents called him Barry, which makes a certain sort of sense. He becomes Barack in Chicago. He embraces that side of him, working on South Side of Chicago on some very difficult issues in regard to housing, crime, in regard to healthcare access, poor schools, and so forth. And I think it's we can believe his own autobiography on this. It's the time in his life that he felt most part of a community. And he, in his own words, and this is believable too, he goes about creating a racial identity in a sort of roundabout way. And what he sees in Chicago is absolutely crucial to that. It's at a time when Chicago has its first Black mayor, Harold Washington. And I think he's deeply inspired by that, in addition to Jesse Jackson's 2 runs for president in 1984 and 1988. And of course, Jackson is a Chicagoan, and his Rainbow Coalition is housed in Chicago and so forth. So I think those are very formative years for him. Again, the ambition is there in regard to, he goes off to Harvard. And so it's literally a night and day sort of coming out of South Side, depressed, economically strapped Chicago into Columbia and Harvard, or Harvard after the Chicago experience. And then back to Chicago to become a politician in the State House. I think there's a will to serve, there's a will to public service alongside the sort of what's the next big game, what's the next big step, it's Columbia, and then it's Harvard, then it's the State House, and then it's the US Senate. So that's there too, the ambition in addition to the will to serve.
You mentioned his first campaigns. Where did he get his campaigning style from, and why was it so effective in Illinois? And does it change from those earlier campaigns to the national campaigns, or first the statewide office, then national campaigns? The change in the style?
The early campaign, his first campaign is for the State House, to be a Illinois senator. So he runs in 1996 to do that against his wife's better judgment, perhaps, or maybe not. He wins. He runs in 2000 for a U.S. House seat, that of Bobby Rush, who was a congressman, Black congressman in Chicago. And to look at his style, you can understand why he didn't win that election. He was very professorial. There was one story in which that said that he put a whole church congregation to sleep, just listening to his professorial style about what the problems of the community were and why they should vote for him. And his opponent, Bobby Rush, used his biography to devastating effect. So his Harvard credentials made him an educated fool. He was an outsider, the ultimate outsider. He is from not even the South, but he was out from the Pacific, the ultimate outsider. He didn't speak the language of the common people. He was preaching to them. He was lecturing them as a law professor would lecture folks. And then on and on and on in regard to, again, bending his biography in a way that made him the consummate outsider to Chicago politics and the Black communities that he hoped to represent in the House of Representatives. And Bobby Rush demolishes him in that particular election. He learns from it, though. He immerses himself more, I think, in Black Chicago as he continues his life in the Illinois State House. He learns the language, I think, of his Black constituencies a bit more than he had before. He makes a lot of, he's a person that seeks out mentors and advisors. And in some instances, I think the sort of missing father figure. And that's how I think his interactions with Jeremiah Wright, his minister, was. He was the spiritual father that his biological father had never been. So he's a person who's not averse to seeking out mentors and advisors and connections with the right people as he's making this ascent up the ladder of politics. So I think there are notable changes between let's say the 2000 Barack Obama, who's putting the church congregation to sleep, and the 2008 Barack Obama with the rousing speeches and yes we can and hope and change. He learns, he grows as a politician. Even to the point that we could say he was a bit charismatic on the campaign trail by 2008. That had not always been the case with him. I think by nature and what people tell me about him in private, it's much more the professor. It's the guy who's very cerebral. It's the guy who's always thinking 3 or 4 steps in front of the crowd. That's his DNA, as opposed to the guy who gives the rousing yes we can speech. There are no red states, no blue states, they're just the United States. That he learns that. That's not natural to him, but
between 2000 and 2008, he's working on that ability to communicate and not just explain.
Yes, right. Communicate and not just explain, and to also appear to be doing it authentically.
You know, what's interesting though about that, because I think did a really wonderful job of synthesizing those ideas, because he's still, even in sort of these very charismatic rhetorical flourishes, could be explaining some things for us as well. So he was really able to kind of keep that core erudition as well as the new charismatic element that he has. Very impressive. I'm curious about the sort of the political history that why was it the right time in 2008, do you think, for Barack Obama? You know, when we're handling, we've got John McCain and Hillary Rodham Clinton. What was the opening that was there for him, do you think?
I think there were several. I think that one was that the Bush presidency, Americans have about 8 years attention span when it comes to presidents. And I think it was actually shorter than that. They're tired of the person in the White House before the 8 years are over. So our attention span is, you know, at most about a term and a half. You know, by the time you get to that last year or so, that person is probably not electable to a third term if we allowed that. It's might be. I could see perhaps a Reagan, maybe. Certainly FDR, Roosevelt, but most the shelf life is about, you know, 5 or 6 years, and then we want something new. So I think with the Bush presidency sort of limping to its conclusion, burdened by a couple of wars, one of which most of the American people by this time were against, the war in Iraq, then the plunge into the Great Recession, which is the death knell of George Bush's reputation. And that's the big opening too for Barack Obama as well. I think people make the distinction between, you know, sort of hope and change, or change elections or status quo elections. And again, this is, you can map this kind of onto our attention span as American voters. 2008, I think, was one of those change elections. People had enough of not only George Bush, but perhaps the likes of the Clintons as well. And they wanted something new. And that helps the newcomer in the case of Barack Obama. I think he has his finger on the pulse of a lot of the things that Americans were comfortable with. They were comfortable with seeing changes in our healthcare policy. They were comfortable with opposition to the war in Iraq. They were comfortable with doing whatever was possible, this economic collapse, free fall that we were in. And Obama, you know, he had answers to those questions that John McCain did not have, not at least not as readily as Obama. And John McCain, of course, in many people's mind would have been a third Bush term. And that was not necessarily appetizing to the American electorate. So there are a number of openings that Obama was, in his campaign, were able to exploit or to take advantage of to allow him to get elected to this office. And he had a masterful, his team had a masterful understanding of, I think, the technology of elections, that is using the internet to raise money, small sums of money from a vast number of people, as opposed to hitting up the same big donors, you know, until they maxed out. And then you're finding yourself in a situation in which you're going to have a dry spell because you've maxed out all the big donors. Better to hit a lot of folks with $10, $15, and just keep going back to those folks over the internet, and they just go to your web, press a button, than to be overly dependent upon the big donors, who eventually will max out because of the system that we have, and then you'll have to just take a dry spell. Facebook, internet, social media, and so forth, they have a masterful operation compared to John McCain, which is a much more traditional campaign that's run. I think that hurts him as well, and maybe a less than judicious pick of a vice presidential candidate on the part of John McCain as well. I don't think that his vice presidential candidate, helped him as much as they were hoping that the candidate would.
That vice presidential candidate might have been a few years too early.
to put it kindly, perhaps.
You write that there was in his administration, there was tension between, quote, the universalist, seemingly race-neutral policy prescriptions of the Obama administration and the adamant demands by some Black people for more targeted relief for African Americans. You describe his relationship with the Congressional Black Caucus as, quote, cordial, though largely aloof, end quote. So this is interesting. You know, his campaign is driven to, he gets elected by the majority of the American people, but there's a particular expectations in the Black community. Could you speak a little bit about that tension and his relationship with Black leadership?
And that is a tension, Max, and it's a tension that goes throughout his presidency. That is, so he won 96% of the African-American vote in 2008. And he won 93% in 2012, which is in the grand scheme of things, if you want to contextualize the presidency, that's not unusual. Bill Clinton was winning those lopsided margins. I think Hillary Clinton won like 89% of the Black vote, and Biden and so forth. So those margins aren't out of kilter with other candidates, Democratic presidential candidates. There were those, and I understand the reasoning behind their reasoning. There were those in academia, Black academics, in politics, the Congressional Black Caucus, and other places that were saying, okay, in the midst of this economic calamity in which African Americans were at the bottom of it, you could just look at the empirical data, the statistics for unemployment, household wealth loss, loss of homes, incarceration rates, across the board. African Americans were at the bottom of those statistics. So the argument was that when this group goes out and votes for you and gives you 96% of their vote, and the same group is at the bottom of this economic calamity, poverty rates, and everything else, you owe that group not only for that vote, but also to help the most vulnerable and those who experience this calamity the worst. And those who were critics of him along those lines, for the most part, remain critics of him along those lines. Well, Obama's position is, well, he's the president of the entire United States. He could not target remedies in that sort of way towards a particular group as the president of the United States. And in the practicality, or being pragmatic, the thinking was that if you want a second term, you're not going to target these sorts of remedies and programs and policies towards a particular group who are a minority of the electorate. Although they gave you 96% of the vote, most of Obama's voters were white voters. So if he was thinking about a second term, you couldn't just have policy a Black agenda and target the suffering of Black people as awful and as bad as it was in every metric, and then still, be competitive in 2012. So he preferred these sort of universalist, broad sweep policies. The Affordable Care Act is, I think, the best quintessential example of that, in which the goal in this case is to everyone to get health insurance. Okay, so making it affordable, you provide subsidies to the health insurance companies, the private companies, and you provide subsidies to the buyers of health insurance, and then you would expand Medicaid that would catch everyone who couldn't buy health insurance, even with the subsidies and so forth. You'd expand Medicaid. So on the face of it, a race neutral policy, right? Okay, expanding Medicaid, helping people with subsidies to pay for private insurance on the exchanges. If you open the hood of the policy, you'll see the fine print that the most vulnerable folks, African Americans, poor people, working class, Hispanics would benefit most from this policy. And that is how it has turned out for the most part, that they disproportionately have benefited. So for Obama, you sort of got a win-win. That is, you didn't have a policy that was targeted towards a particular group of voters, but again, in the fine print, it did help the most vulnerable, and that caught a lot of African Americans in that group of. So the rising tide lifts all boats. You have the broad brush policy. Pell Grants would be another example. He increased the amount of Pell Grants, which ideally helps all students who were needy, but it disproportionately helps African American students and other students, among whom the poverty rate is highest. For many, that was not enough. It looked like sitting on the fence. It looked like centrist politics at its worst. That this guy should have, in their thinking, he had this ethical responsibility to say that there are people among us who suffer the foreclosure crisis worse, that are suffering a worse unemployment rate, or are suffering a worse poverty rate, have hunger and food insecurity worse. And as president, as an ethical being in the world, I'm going to address that regardless of the politics. That's a heavy lift for any politician, and especially one who's doing the calculus of re-election, which President Obama is doing. So he splits the loaf. He splits the he goes for a glass half full, and again, broad brush policies that, if positioned right, could help the most vulnerable.
We're going to take questions from the audience very soon. So I want to remind folks to put questions in the question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, and get ready out in the audience for questions. Like everything, it goes too quickly. I have so many things I want to ask.
We just started.
Exactly, we just started. But we'll get great questions from the audience, I'm sure. On racism, you write, quote, "I am less concerned with the minutiae of policy differences between Democrats and Republicans than with the blatant and surreptitious deployment of race to serve political ends." What does it say? What does it say about Obama and the politics of race in America that before Obama we have the Republican Party of Bush, and after Obama we have the Republican Party of Trump?
It's complicated in several ways. The whole promise of Obama is that he's going to make us think better about ourselves as Americans. And he's going to try to help us think more positively about the possibilities of race. That's the whole promise, the whole hope and change. Yes, we can. No red states, no blue states. The whole promise is an optimistic one about potential, and for us to buy into the potential of America. And he was represented. He was, of course, the vehicle. The African-American man no one ever heard of. His father's straight from Africa. Was born in the middle of the Pacific. He's married to an African-American woman. They have children and so forth. And the country not only votes once, but twice. He gets reelected with pretty comfortable margins in the Electoral College and in the popular vote, which we don't see nowadays, and haven't really seen since maybe the Clinton years, but even Bill Clinton never won a majority of the popular vote. He won pluralities. So on that score, his election, I think, says something very great about the potential in regard to race in this country. However, on the other side of that, and as you framed it, Max, how do we explain his successor in the moment that we're in? Race is the through line, and it's not, of course, is the oldest story in the American narrative, race. It's not the case that Donald Trump invented anything new. I think that if anything he invented is stylistically, and that's the new part of him. But in regard to the sort of his thinking on race or the nativism, this sort of anti-immigrant stuff that he has been known for, the Islamophobia and the Muslim ban, his thinking about, his attacks on Black athletes and Black urban voters and stuff. I think that's been par for the course, particularly among the right for a while. If there's a particular genius about Trump, is that he has his finger on the pulse of the Republican base voter. And he reads them better than perhaps anyone in my lifetime has. And he gives voice to a narrative that's easy to understand. It's a simplistic narrative. He even says itself, he even said himself, I alone can fix it. So if ever there is something simple and digestible, it's a simple narrative, it's simple slogans, it's build a wall, it's Muslim ban, it's a language that anyone can understand. And he's a pure distillation of a number of things that were already in American culture. We have a long history of hating immigrants. That's not new to us at all. Even in a country that fancies itself a country of immigrants, and it's part of our national identity, and that's true. This is a country of immigrants, whether voluntary or involuntary, people being forced here, but it's a country of immigrants. But it's also a country that has a history of crushing hostility towards immigrants. So that's not new. Trump again gives simplistic, sort of boisterous voice to that. I think the racism is not new. He gives voice to it in ways that people can understand it. He understands that roughly half of American voters, maybe a little less than half of American voters, were ready for that message, and ready for the message even from a vehicle such as he. Someone's never held elective or appointed office, a string of failed businesses behind him, a reality TV host. That was his claim to fame as he was running. But even he could be a vessel for this sort of racialized populism that he's offering. In the moment of having a Black president that roughly half, or many in the country thought was out of place. Trump's claim to fame is the lie that he was not even born here. How could he be legitimate? He was born in Kenya somewhere. And that's his claim to fame. He rises in Republican politics based on a bald-faced lie. But about half of the country is willing to either believe that or give him a pass and believe some of the other things that he's selling in regard to race and immigration and so forth.
Well, we have, like I said, we have so many more questions that I could ask you, and I hope that you folks out here have some questions. So thank you, Claude, for the wonderful responses to my questions. And if you'd like to write answers to all the rest of them, you can later. But let's take some. I'm going to just ask the folks here in the audience if you could keep your question a little bit short, so that because nobody out there will be able to hear it, and I'll repeat it for the people out there. So any questions in the audience here? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, well, this is a great book, and I'm looking forward to reading it. What you said, the question that you asked about Obama's attention toward the African American community, we asked the same in Africa. Say that Clinton and Bush did more for Africa than Obama. How do you respond to that?
So the question was, in Africa, there is a narrative that Bush and Clinton did more for Africa than Obama did. So the question is, how do you explain that?
Yes, I think this. I think the same thing is going on with Africa. There's a whole chapter on Africa in the book. I think the same thing is going on in regard to Africa as it is with African Americans. That is, this reluctance to appear to be favoring your own group, to appear to not be concerned about the larger constituencies that you're representing. Even further than that, and he gets a lot of criticism about this, whether rightly or wrongly, but even further than that, to occasionally make yourself appear in opposition and to scold and to critique African Americans and Africans as well. It's a less generous reading is that this is just a blatant appeal to white voters to say that, oh, if we vote for this guy, he's not going to favor his own group. Listen to what he's saying. He's telling, African Americans to, raise your kids, be better fathers, pull up your pants, don't walk around sagging. He's telling Africans that we're not going to just give you money. We're not just going to give you aid. Africans have to help themselves and so forth. We'll help you after we see you helping yourselves. And some of his critics in Africa and elsewhere are saying, he's not saying that to Europeans. He doesn't talk to Vladimir Putin like that. He doesn't talk to the Chinese like, he doesn't scold them when he sits down with them. Why is he scolding us in this sort of way? I think that that's one of the places that he legitimately can be, and he was taken to task in regard to his approach to politics. This sort of this need to show that he could be, hard on those perceived to be in his own group. This tough love that he could direct towards African Americans and Africans. In the case of African Americans, there's only 2 polls during the 8 years he's president in which he is not polling at 80%. He polls pretty well for a while among Africans for about the first 2 years. There were selected countries that people were polled in Africa in regard to the support for him. For the first 2 years, he does well, and it sort of drops off after that. He does really bad in Muslim majority countries. Most of the time he does. He does really well in Kenya, of course, where his father is from. But there's certainly a cooling off. I think the expectations were first too high among African Americans and other people around the world. But I think the honeymoon is over, especially in regard to Africa after the first 2 years, when it appears that he's going to be much like the average American president and not pay a whole lot of attention to Africa. And then there were those who were saying, as the audience member, my good colleague George, said that he was not as good as his Republican predecessor Bush on things such as fighting HIV/AIDS, things such as agricultural assistance and lowering tariffs and things of that nature. That Obama at best was second fiddle to even his most immediate Republican predecessor.
And you say about foreign policy that his, quote, stated principles often took a backseat to pragmatic realism during the administration's pursuit of foreign policy. That seems like a through line in a lot of his policies, foreign policy or whatnot, this pragmatic caution that he had.
Yes,
for sure. We have a question here from Mohammed out in the online audience, asking, going back to about African American identity in Obama. The question is, how much African American is Obama? Does this question contribute to the support he receives from whites? Does this question also explain his failure to help the African American population? You've touched on some of these things, but if there's some other elements of this, maybe in particular that second part of the question, whether his background helped him with white voters.
Oh, I absolutely think it does. I think that the background is exotic. You know, this guy's born in Hawaii in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. His father's from Kenya, his mother's from Kansas. They meet at the University of Hawaii. He goes to the mainland. He gets steeped in Black South Side Chicago and is a community organizer. And then he's off to Harvard. Then he's, the lone U.S. Black senator for a while. So I think the biography has a lot to do with it. I think his phenotype works in his behalf. He looks mixed. He looks like he's straddling the racial, boundaries in regard to phenotype. If he was a conspicuously Black man, dark-skinned Black man from, let's say, Georgia, I don't know if that plays as well in regard to the white population or the African American population. I think that the phenotype, the mixed background, the sort of racial ambiguity that he has probably works in his favor more often than not in the kinds of circles he's in. And even though he's married to an African American woman who can trace her ancestry to Georgia and slavery and so forth, even she has a certain sort of pedigree. She goes to Princeton and then Harvard, and she's a lawyer in this storied firm in Chicago. So they're not the average typical, media portrayal of Blacks. Not even the Huxtables. They're not even the Cosbys. There's something even different from that. On the positive side, it sort of expands the parameters of what a Black person can be. But at the same time, I think it strains for a lot of folks that whole notion of Blackness to the point that, can we talk about it in any concrete ways? Or can we talk about it in regard to this particular guy that has any real meaning?
One of the points you have in your book is about the diversity of the Black population, and that's an incredibly important point. So maybe there is a virtue in straddling these worlds for the African American population. It's a diverse, they can see many aspects of the African American experience within him. I don't know. We'll have a good question over here from Lloyd. Go ahead.
I have two questions. One, we often talk about presidents being transformative, like Roosevelt. Could it be that Obama was transformative, but maybe not in the way he expected, and that he has generated a vehement right-wing, conservative, even anti-democratic response that we couldn't see originally? And secondly, did you interview Obama himself at any point for this book, or does your account differ from his memoir?
So I'll just rephrase that quickly for the audience at home. The first question was about Obama as a transformative president, and maybe the transformation is indicative in what we see in the current political climate, not the way we like to think of transformation. And the other question was just about, did you interview Barack Obama directly?
Okay. In terms of transformation, was he transformative? Yes, in the ways that we like to think of a president being transformative, and then yes, in the way that you mentioned too, that is us in the current moment as well, whether that's any fault of his own or inadvertently he's transforming, having a transformative effect. To his credit, his administration, it walks into this Great Recession, the worst economic collapse that we've had as a country since the Great Depression. Very few people alive in 2008 had any memory of the Great Depression. So he walks into that. The automobile industry is in collapse. The mortgage loan industry is frozen up. You have big banks that are collapsing. People by the millions are losing their homes. Unemployment spikes and so forth. So he's walking into that. And the country recovers from it. We don't go into a depression, although you could say some of the metrics for African Americans are depression level metrics, but the country does come out of that. It tends to be the case that people don't notice good or decent management, but they really notice bad management and bad leadership. So I think that Obama deserves, his administration and those working with his administration deserve some credit for this economic collapse not being much worse than it was. And of course, they would have gotten all the blame if it had been as bad as it could have been. So I think in that way, he saves the country from a even worse catastrophe than it could have been. So whether or not that's transformative or not, it certainly sets the table for the Biden administration, which is thinking in sort of New Deal ways in regard to the Obama administration was only talking in terms of hundreds of billions of dollars, which at the time seemed like a whole lot of money. We're talking trillions of dollars now. So and the government directly injecting itself into people's lives. So I think the Obama administration, one of the things he said as he was running for office, he wanted to try to make government cool again. I don't think he succeeded in that, but I think he certainly got us used to the idea of government being much more involved in the economy and the healthcare system, fighting climate change and so forth. And I think that Joe Biden is kind of the fulfillment, or he has positioned himself as the fulfillment of that. I think on the other side of it, I think that you can't understand a Trump presidency without understanding that the guy before him was a two-term African-American. Trump makes no sense to me in regard to as anywhere near an electable figure, but for he's the anti-Obama, and he consciously positions himself as that. I think some of the things going on in American conservatism are going on the right, predate Obama and probably George Bush as well. And Trump is the sort of hardening of that, whether it's immigration and some other things, and race as well. But yeah, I think that Obama is inadvertently transformative insofar as as he makes about half of the country comfortable with the prospects of a Trump presidency. I have unfortunately not had the opportunity. Well, I sought the opportunity on a number of occasions to interview the former president, but his press people, his gatekeepers, said several times to me in emails that the former president is really busy. He gets 1,000 of these kinds of, the language, best wishes with your book. So I as close as I got to interview a number of people around him, such as Melanie Barnes, who was an assistant to the president and the head of his domestic White House policy council, a few sort of mid-level people in the administration, and others who have been in meetings with him and sort of got some of the private angle, but I have not had the opportunity to actually meet the former president. I hope the book maybe is it's after the fact, but if you're listening, President Obama, I would love to have the opportunity to hear it from your mouth. Yes.
I know he's going to read it, right? So we send him a signed copy and he'll have to read it.
Yeah. He's a reader and he has a historical sense. So.
Well, we have just time for one more question. It's from Helen Warren. Going back to his rhetorical flourishes, is there any reason to believe that eloquence, the capacity to capture ideas and identities in uplifting transcendent language, explains Obama's popularity?
Yes, absolutely. Especially after 8 years of a president who was less careful in his use of language and it was not necessarily a charismatic man and so forth. So I think Obama gives the genre of political eloquence, a new lease on life, in ways that very few, I think. I think that, Franklin Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, maybe one or two others, Abraham Lincoln, although we've never heard his voice, but if you read some of his writings, they're very evocative, what he says at Gettysburg and so forth, and the other writings of President Lincoln. So we've had a few people in that office who that knew that words matter and words coming from this office matter, and have been excellent wordsmiths, whether it's them writing the things, which Lincoln wrote his own stuff, and Obama wrote a lot of his, not all of his speeches, but he wrote a good amount of it. Reagan, not so much, but he had really good speech writers, and he had the presence. He was an actor by voice training, and he used that to very, stunning effect in the right settings. So yes, yes to your question. It does matter that we have a president who's serious about political oratory and about words, and has a sort of mastery of presentation.
Well, in terms of mastery of presentation and eloquence, I don't think we could be any better than Dr. Claude Clegg.
thank
Please
you.
put your hands together for Claude Clegg and for the new book, The Black President.
Thank you.
This has been a really wonderful conversation. I figured we'd get to about 7% of the questions that I wrote up, and I think we did, but there's a lot more time to talk about this, and you're always welcome to come back and talk with us. Thank you to Flyleaf Books, such a great place. Please know that it's a sign of civilization to have a fully independent bookstore. Come down, shop at Flyleaf Books, not right now because we're closing, but thank you, Maggie and Morella and everybody here for putting this together. Thank you, Vicky, back there. Lloyd, good to see you. Good to see all colleagues here, and we will see all of you next time. I do want to remind folks quickly about Carolina Public Humanities. If you like biographies, tomorrow is the next version of Lunch with Friends and Strangers, our biography program. We'll be talking with Gabby Calvacaresi about the poet Nikki Finney. That's at 12 o'clock. That's an online program. And remember, right here at Flyleaf Books, we have continuing our Humanities in Action series Wednesdays at 3:30. And next up is Erica Wilson talking about critical race theory and the law. So very important topics. We look forward to seeing you, hopefully here at Flyleaf Books. And if not here at Flyleaf Books, out in the ether or one of our events. One more time, Claude Clegg, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all. Have a good evening.